thanks for tuning in to the webinar, and thanks to John and the Biofouling Partnership for inviting me to give this talk. So a quick plug to get us started. As John said, I work at the Cawthron Institute in sunny Nelson. So Cawthron is New Zealand's largest independent science organisation, and we offer a broad range of services to help protect the environment and support sustainable development of primary industries. And I'm based in the biosecurity team, and we work closely with the aquaculture industry on a range of issues across all sectors. And so today I'm going to talk to you about how biofouling is affecting the New Zealand salmon industry in particular. So the New Zealand salmon industry, we farm Chinook salmon, and we produce about 50% of the global supply. This is worth around $110 million in export revenue. So on a global scale, it's not a very big industry, I guess, but it's really important regionally and nationally in terms of jobs and economic earnings for New Zealand. And so salmon are produced in 3 regions of the South Island, including freshwater farms and the hydro canals. But the most production is sea cage farming, and the majority is in the Marlborough Sounds region, which is at the top of New Zealand's South Island. So biofouling accumulation presents an ongoing operational challenge for finfish aquaculture globally. So farms have a considerable amount of submerged surfaces, and this includes the cage structures themselves, as well as the mooring lines and the production nets. And biofouling adds weight and drag on the farms, and growth on the nets can also lead to reduced water flow through the pens. And this has associated effects to fish health because of reduced oxygen into the farm, and also the reduced removal of waste out of the farm. So in New Zealand, we often use a double net system because we have to protect the fish from predators such as seals. So we have quite a lot of seals in New Zealand. So essentially the fish are in individual pens, and then the whole farm is surrounded in a second net, which has larger openings. And this is called the predator net. So having biofouling growth on both these nets has the potential to severely affect water flow within the farm. So here's an idea of what a salmon farm net looks like underwater. So ideally, our nets would be clean and they would look like those ones on the left, with no biofouling growth to block the water flow through the farm. However, after only a few weeks, we can get considerable growth on these nets, and they more often than not look like the ones on the right, with biofouling present on the submerged surfaces. And the majority of finfish aquaculture industry globally uses biocidal anti-fouling paints to manage this growth. And mostly this is copper-based coatings, although there's some alternatives utilising different biocides that are also available. And the effectiveness of these coatings decreases through time. So the nets either need to be removed and replaced, or they need to be managed using cleaning in the later stages of the coating life. However, leaching of the copper within these paints, it presents an environmental hazard as it can accumulate in the sediments, and that potentially affects the benthic communities that live in these areas. So in the New Zealand salmon industry, we only ever used anti-fouling coatings on the outer predator net, and these nets were treated, placed on the farm and left in place for up to 2 years before they were removed and replaced. And the inner pen nets were managed using a process called lift and blast. And this is where the fish were moved to a neighbouring pen, and the net is raised out of the water and it's manually cleaned through water blasting, and then it's left to dry before it's put back in the water and the fish are moved back in. And these pens were generally cleaned on a 4-week cycle, as that's how long it took to get around all of the pens in a farm. So they would start in one and then move around. So due to concerns regarding the environmental impacts of copper-based coatings and the public perception surrounding this, the New Zealand salmon industry has moved away from the use of anti-foul nets, and there's been largely no use of anti-fouling since around 2012. In addition, over roughly the last 5 years, most of the salmon farms in New Zealand have transitioned to larger 40 by 40 metre style pens, and we used to have 20 by 20 was the size of the original farms. And so these new larger nets are too large to be lifted out of the water, and so the lift and blast process is no longer possible. And so basically all the production nets in New Zealand salmon farms are now cleaned in water instead, using specialised high pressure cleaning machines. And there's some examples of some of the options that are available here on the slide. And the pen nets are now cleaned up to weekly in summer, with these cleaning activities often operating on really tight schedules because there's only a certain number of cleaning machines and vessels, and they have to get around all of the farms. So here's an example of a New Zealand-made autonomous cleaning machine, the Autoboss. So it essentially crawls around the inside of the pen. So it has these little like fingers that it holds onto the net with, and then it moves itself along the sides. And basically the cleaning part of the machine is lowered and raised up and below that bit that's above the water. And as is standard industry practice, there's no waste capture during this process. So the biofouling that's dislodged off the pens is released into the environment. And so around the time the farm switched to in-water net cleaning, the fish started to develop skin health issues. So circular spots and lesions are generally the most common, although sometimes the skin damage can also be found in lines on the skin. And fish with spots were found to be more vulnerable to pathogens. With the initial skin trauma, it's often followed by a secondary infection, in particular in the summer months. And these skin health issues represent an economic loss to the company due to downgrades of the fish at processing. So they're not worth as much as a perfect salmon. In addition, if the spots progress to more severe ulcers, this can also be associated with fish mortality in some cases. And so the location of these spots was suggestive of the fish contacting something in the water column, and it was possible that there could be a relationship with the biofouling community that was being dislodged during net cleaning. And so this brings us to the nadarians, which is a group of animals that possess the ability to sting. And so this includes sea anemones, corals, sea pens, hydroids, and jellyfish. And they're often a dominant member of biofouling communities. So a good example of this is the salmon aquaculture nets in Norway. So they're often completely covered in a monoculture of hydroids. And so a unique feature of this group is that they have these little harpoons, stinging cells, and they're called Pneumaticists. And they use these to capture prey and for defense against predators. And so the pneumaticist, it contains a barb, and then that can release toxins, and the thread often features spines that prevent the barb being removed from the target after it's stung. And so some species release their pneumaticist directly when they're disturbed, and some species produce these mucus strings. So the picture on the right there is of the white-striped anemone with lots of these mucus strings it's released. And each of those can contain thousands of pneumaticysts. So following the initial skin health issues, Cawthron carried out a survey of nets and pontoons at 3 salmon farms during August 2013. And we found 8 species of nadarians present on these farms, and they were found in really high densities. So this assessed communities at 5, 10 and 15 metres, and also the pontoons, which are the structures that hold the nets up. And so we found up to 10,000 individuals per metre squared for the hydroid ectopleura. So that's that white picture in the middle there with the pink-hearted hydroid. And then also up to 1,600 individuals per metre squared for the white-striped anemone anthozoe. So that's the anemone on the left of the screen there. And we were also made aware of another smaller transparent anemone, which is only really present on the farms during the summer months. And so we did some molecular analysis on this species and confirmed it to be within the Viatrix genus. And at present, there's only 5 species that have been described. And it was found to be most closely related to the turtlegrass anemone found in the Caribbean. And that species is known to be really highly toxic, and there's actually warning sheets for divers in that region. But yeah, interestingly, this small anemone had never been previously described in New Zealand, so we're uncertain as to whether it's an invasive species. So more recently, we've carried out lab-based investigations into the biology of the most common anemones present on the farms. So we had a student, Beth, working on this topic last summer, and she did some really nice work investigating Pneumaticists length and how this relates to potential risk. So we found that the average Pneumaticists length for all 3 species that she looked at was larger than the mean skin thickness for salmon of a range of sizes. And so this supports the theory that Pneumaticists may be causing the initial skin trauma. Also, the Pneumaticists length of 2 of these species was shown to not significantly increase with anemone size. So that's the plot on the right. And that's really interesting because it indicates that the anemones are a risk to the fish right from the beginning, right from when they first settle, as opposed to what we had theorized that maybe they had to get to a certain size before they were able to sting the fish. But actually, really, really small anemones have Pneumaticists of a suitable length. And the salmon industry has also carried out some projects investigating the risk of anemones to their stock. So they looked at settlement rates for the transparent anemone specifically, and that's the plot on the left, and it showed that it's a really rapid colonizer of cleaned nets. So they found up to 270 anemones per 10 centimetres squared after only 7 days. And that's roughly the length of time that the nets are left between cleaning and the summer at the moment. And they also found higher settlement at the 10 to 15 metre depth range, which was interesting. They've also carried out some basic challenge trials exposing fish to the mucus strings produced by the white-striped anemone, and the results indicated the stings can cause severe damage over only a really short amount of time. And so fish have a pretty good natural defence system in their skin and their scales. But once that system is breached, for instance, by sting, they're a lot more vulnerable to pathogens, thermal stress, and other factors that can increase mortality. And this is particularly relevant at the moment with rising water temperatures, an increasing issue for most salmon farming regions in New Zealand, particularly in the Marlborough Sounds, which is our main growing region. And we've had, so 5 of the last 7 summers have been the hottest on record. So we're recording water temperatures of up to 20 degrees in the summer months, which is really not ideal for salmon farming. And increased water temperatures have been associated with bacterial infections and with the fish less resilient to external stresses. So I always like this picture. It's a really nice illustration of this. It's a scanning electron microscope micrograph from the margin of a skin lesion on an Atlantic salmon in Norway. So the fish at that farm were affected by a jellyfish bloom with a subsequent tenacibaculosis outbreak. And so if you look at the zoomed micrograph on the right, it shows the bacteria entering the holes where the Pneumaticists have pierced the fish skin. And the recent increase in jellyfish blooms globally has been associated with climate change and warming sea temperatures. So this could become a more regular occurrence in the future. We also believe it's another important thing to note is that the New Zealand aquaculture industry is moving towards offshore farming. And we currently don't know what types of biofouling organisms are going to settle in these environments. So we know anemones prefer high current cool waters, and that was really nicely illustrated in a recent assessment of an offshore mussel farm in the North Island, and the farm structures were completely covered in anemones. And so it's really important that the industry considers the implications of biofouling growth and how this will be managed in these future offshore farms. And we believe it's crucial to understand the biology and ecology of problem taxa, as this enables more effective management of risk. So some of our ongoing research topics in this space include characterising the spatial and temporal patterns of recruitment of higher risk taxa, including relating these to current net cleaning schedules. So we recently carried out quite a large field component for this, which involved deployments during summer and winter, looking at how fast the biofouling growth grows over a range of deployment ages. So we're analysing those photos and assessing that at the moment. We're also assessing the toxicity of specific species to determine if they're producing bioactive compounds, and including looking at if some are more toxic than others. So in particular, we're really interested in the transparent anemone and whether that's got any interesting toxins. And we're also looking into the microbiome composition of different species to determine if they have specific bacterial agents related to skin health issues, because it's been found in jellyfish in particular that they often have a sort of mutual relationship with tenacibacillus bacteria, and they use them to pre-digest food. So we're interested in whether the anemones are doing a similar thing. And lastly, this upcoming summer, we plan to characterise the net cleaning waste, including the viability of the Pneumaticists within this. So the nadarian problem in New Zealand salmon farms is not an easy fix, and there's a need to develop more effective on-farm management of these species. In particular, a focus on fish health and fish survival through the optimization of rearing conditions and the elimination of stresses is really crucial. And this could include a range of approaches, including management based on biology, anti-fouling strategies, cleaning strategies, and therapeutic approaches. And our research feeds into this management. For example, optimise cleaning schedules for specific sites, seasons, or times since last cleaning, when the stinging organisms are less likely to pose a risk. So in summary, while there are environmental advantages to not using biocides, untreated nets require regular in-water cleaning. And as this is generally undertaken without waste recapture, all the biofouling is released into the pen environment. And exposure of the fish to this material can cause skin health issues, and the fish are more vulnerable to pathogens and thermal stress. And understanding the biology and ecology of high-risk biofouling taxa can lead to more efficient management of risk, and improved management of salmon health issues in New Zealand farms has been estimated to be worth up to $40 million a year in additional revenue by 2030. So it's a really important topic to be focusing on. So I just want to thank the numerous colleagues at Cawthron who've been part of this work over the years, and also New Zealand King Salmon, who have been really awesome in supporting the field aspects of our research. And lastly, MB for funding this research through their Endeavour Fund. And I'm happy to take any questions.